Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle Curtin, and I'm the host of the 327 Mud podcast. In this series, I'll be speaking with uniquely qualified sustainability professionals about their career path, work, and topics regarding consumption and the environment. Today, we'll be speaking with Tighe Sullivan. Tighe is a climate strategist at Patch, which is a startup focused on providing a virtual marketplace connecting carbon credit buyers and sellers. Tighe builds relationships with corporations and helps them drive climate finance to carbon removal and reduction projects throughout the world. Prior to joining Patch, Tighe worked in business development primarily in the marketing and advertising space. Tighe received his bachelor's in political science with a minor in economics from Colgate University and is currently pursuing a master's in sustainability management at Columbia University. Tighe is a classmate of mine and someone I enjoy speaking with to clarify confusion on the very interesting world of carbon credits. Today, we'll be talking about his path to becoming a climate strategist at Patch and learn about what carbon credits are, why they exist, and how they can be used to reduce consumption. So without further ado, let's get started. Tighe, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Kyle. Excited to be here.
Yeah, sweet. So just to get started, could you explain what your current position is at Patch and what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so at Patch, I'm on the climate strategy and solutions team. What that means is we help typically the buy side of the market, so companies looking to take action beyond their value chain through the purchase of carbon credits to understand the market. It is a very nuanced and rapidly evolving space. So I help them think about different project types, whether that's reforestation all the way to direct air capture, biochar, everything in between. I help companies think about what claims they want to make associated with the purchase of their carbon credits. So I think we'll talk a little bit about the changing claims landscape in today's conversation. And then I also liaise between the demand side of the marketplace and our suppliers, who we work with quite closely at Patch, as the buy side often has questions around individual attributes of the project, which I'm sure we'll also dive into.
Cool. Yeah. And so, based on your bio, it looks like you started at Patch kind of working on go-to-market initiatives. So could you explain how your role has kind of evolved over the last around 2.5 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I used to work at a marketing technology company, selling an affiliate marketing platform to companies. Pretty quickly realized, although I guess it took 2 years, that I was basically helping fuel, consumption and consumerism and people buying things on the internet that they might not need and that might not be sustainable in the long term. And so I decided I wanted to use my sales background and expertise to pivot into the climate space. Pretty quickly started Googling, climate tech business development opportunities, listening to podcasts, networking, and there's a lot more out there in terms of the jobs and the networking capabilities and job boards today than they were even 2 or 3 years ago. But I basically found Patch, and we can talk a little bit more about what we are. But at the highest level, we're a marketplace connecting, supply and demand of carbon credits, like you mentioned in your intro, Kyle. And at the company originally, what I was focused on was new business. So, outbounding, cold calling, cold emailing, bringing companies in the door who want to buy credits from our suppliers. And that was great. We still have a very robust BDR and AE team on the demand side, and they're in charge of, building that funnel and having those conversations and really being the point of contact for the demand side. Ultimately, we also then have a climate strategy team who goes a little bit deeper on the projects. And it's really our job to keep a finger on the pulse of the rapidly changing space, which itself is a full-time job. So I really love it because it's a bit more strategy oriented. I get to, I can spend a couple hours a day reading thought piece articles and scientific papers in the space on different projects, and that's very relevant to my discussions I have with buyers. So it still is sales oriented in that I'm helping our team drive deals to close and ultimately getting financing in the hands of very deserving projects in the process.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. And so, is the pathway to working at a carbon credits marketplace a rigid one? In other words, what kind of skills or experiences uh, does Patch look for when they're hiring new employees?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one that people ask about like the climate tech space in general a lot. And in general, I'd say the answer is no, it's not rigid. It mirrors, especially like the software space. I would say specifically in climate tech, I think you could probably split it out, software versus hardware. In the software space specifically, so like carbon accounting platforms, carbon credit marketplaces like Patch, other companies who are getting VC backed money are going to have software development roles, marketing roles, sales roles, HR roles, recruiting roles that are very similar to what you're going to find in other software companies. And that's a great way for people who care about sustainability and want to dedicate their career to sustainability to make the pivot. And I think that we're seeing like an explosion in that interest over the last couple of years. I was part of that like wave. For hard tech companies, like maybe companies who are doing the physical carbon removal, like a biochar, bio oil, direct air capture company, it's like going to be mechanical engineers, right? So maybe a bit more of a specific skill set for those kinds of opportunities. But still, those companies, they still need recruiters, they still need marketers, they still need salespeople. So even there's opportunities, I think, for anyone to get involved.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. And so, if you're willing to speak a little candidly, what would you say is your favorite or least favorite part about your job, or just kind of like overall working in the climate tech space?
Hmm. Yeah, I think my favorite part is just getting to see the incredible growth in the supply ecosystem. So when I started, there was probably, I'll just take the example of biochar. It's like a project I'm pretty closely focused on right now. There was probably like a handful, 3 to 5 European biochar companies who have sort of been um, selling carbon removal credits on the voluntary carbon market, and we knew them. They were on our platform. Today, there's 100 plus minimum biochar companies who are actively selling credits or in the pipeline to be selling credits as a result of their activity. And they're geographically distributed. They're not only in Europe, they're in Africa, they're in Asia. They're doing really incredible work where they're taking agricultural excess that's typically burned, leading to really harmful local air pollution and obviously climate pollution. And they are turning that into biochar, which is going to increase crop yield, reduce synthetic fertilizer use, and sequester carbon quite durably. And seeing that growth in the supplier ecosystem and just getting to talk to those suppliers every day and help them get matched with demand is very fulfilling, honestly. And it's super interesting. And then it's quite fulfilling when we can help them close a big deal, because I know that that money is going to do real good in a variety of ways. Maybe in the same, relatedly, where working for a marketplace might not, be as exciting as that you're not on the ground with the projects. Like we talk to project developers and they're saying, yeah, I just got back from, Kenya or Namibia or Vietnam, and here's what the project's doing. Here's the update. And that's really cool, right? They get to
Mhm.
be on the ground really close to the action. And so I've gotten closer to the action, moving from maybe the pure sales side to the climate strategy team. But I could totally see a world down the line, maybe working directly for a project developer, or I could just see how that could be very rewarding. And you also get to go very deep on the project. So we of course go deep Patch on the climate strategy team, but say you work for a rice methane reduction project in India, for example, you become an expert in rice methane. And that is very interesting because there's every solution is complex. And I guess getting to dedicate time and really becoming a master of specific technology would also be a cool opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for the elaboration. That definitely makes sense. So to zoom out a bit and focus on kind of the main theme of the conversation, could you explain kind of broadly what carbon credits are and why they exist?
Yeah, how long do you have? I thought we only had an hour. Um, yes. So a carbon credit is a unit that represents a ton of carbon either removed from the atmosphere or avoided being put there in the first place. So if you think about a removal project at its simplest, it's going to be a tree that grows, and through the process of photosynthesis is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, storing carbon in the woody biomass, and breathing out oxygen, right? And at its most complex, it's probably a direct air capture machine that is using a sorbent to, directly suck carbon out of the atmosphere in a very mechanized way. There's a lot of in-between solutions. Biochar is sort of a hybrid, if you will, in between nature-based and engineered are some terms that get thrown around in the industry. Now, on the avoidance side for carbon credits, it could be forest protection, right? You are paying a landowner to for their ecosystem services, really to not knock down the forest and use that for farmland or some other economic opportunity. And other avoidance project types could include a cook stove distribution project. We actually work with this really cool company called Coco. They're based in Kenya. And they're sort of like a cook stoves 2.0 project is how I like to describe them and think about them. They're distributing fuel ATMs in Nairobi that actually distribute bioethanol. I believe it's like molasses from sugarcane. And that is replacing charcoal which is the predominant way of cooking in Kenya and actually much throughout Africa, I believe. And it's also one of the primary deforestation causers. So, right, if you are funding Cocoa to distribute and really subsidize the expansion of their fuel ATM system, what you're effectively doing is you are slowing deforestation from charcoal cultivation. And so that's another type of avoidance project. There's a lot of what's called attributes for carbon credits, which we can also get into. Things like additionality, right? How necessary is the carbon finance for the project to occur? There's permanence. How long is the project storing carbon in, reforestation project that could be 50 to 100 years for a direct air capture company. It could be 1,000 plus for biochar. It's probably somewhere in between. And all of these kind of make the buying decision, difficult for companies. They need advice on strategy and what types of projects to support. And that's a big part of my job as well.
Cool. Yeah. And so you mentioned biochar a few times so far. I've heard the word many times before, but I'm not entirely sure like what it is. I think you mentioned it's kind of between like natural solutions and human engineered solutions. Could you just
Yeah.
elaborate on the definition of it?
Yeah, and it's actually like ancient wisdom, biochar. So you know definitely want to give a shout out to the societies of the past that were using this practice, and it wasn't invented recently, but it's having a resurgence definitely in terms of people being interested in the practice and understanding its multitude of benefits, which are still being discovered. And I can give a couple examples of that, but essentially you're taking agricultural excess or some sort of biomass. It could be from like fire breaks in California, for example, like waste wood, which is also an interesting area. Like in the future, we're going to need all of this waste wood for sustainable aviation fuel. So we have to think about, what's the best way to actually, to source inputs for biochar. But maybe getting ahead of myself. Essentially, you're taking agricultural excess or waste biomass, pyrolyzing it. So you're heating it up really hot. Typically, it needs to be in the absence of oxygen, but either through like an industrial machine that looks like a big metal silo, or through a more artisanal process, typically through what's known as a Kontiki kiln or an open pit. And there's a flame curtain that is hypothetically destroying all the syngas or the majority of the gas that comes off the process, but very oxygen poor environment, and you're creating super carbon rich, basically charcoal biochar, right? And essentially what you're doing in that process is you're taking carbon that would get re-released through the fast carbon cycle, right? That wood waste or that corn stalk or whatever you're using, that coconut husk, would dissolve into the topsoil and pretty quickly get re-released. With biochar, you're then essentially moving that carbon to the slow carbon cycle, where it's going to live for 200 to 1,000 plus years, depending on its ultimate end life. Typically, what biochar is used for today is as a soil amendment. So you're mixing it with like compost or farm soil, and you're spreading it on a farm. And I mentioned some of the benefits earlier: improved yield, water retention, less use of fertilizer. It actually also leads to increased soil, organic carbon content aside from what's actually already stored in the biochar. But then, yeah, that's when the permanence comes in, right? How long is it lasting in the soil? Studies are showing 200 to 1,000 plus years. There's also other really exciting use cases. There's a company we're working with out of Europe. I'm not sure if I can share the name, but essentially they're experimenting with putting biochar into asphalt and on roadways, and you're avoiding additional inputs or additional carbon emissions related to those inputs. And relatedly, there's a lot of like really cool concrete companies either using biochar or other inputs to reduce the carbon intensity of concrete. And they're either generating avoidance credits, removal credits, or hybrid avoidance and removal credits through those activities.
Wow, really cool. I actually had no idea that that is something that people did. That's a pretty fascinating process. So could you explain a little bit about the role of carbon credits in the kind of larger idea of the whole system? And the word that I've been thinking about is like the carbon budget system. I know it doesn't, exist at the moment, but could you explain the idea of how it's designed essentially to lower consumption over time?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just writing down some notes. So in terms of the need, right, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has said that we need anywhere between 5 to 16 gigatons of durable carbon removal per year by 2050 in order to basically compensate for the ongoing emissions that we expect in that year, even if all of the planned reduction does occur over the next 20 some odd years. And it's crazy to think about that we're not that far away from 2050. And so that's to hit net zero, right? We have a global net zero target in 2050. The emissions out need to equal the emissions that we're ultimately removing from the atmosphere through durable carbon removal. And for context, depending on how you define durability, right, there's no like agreed upon, okay, durable is over 1,000. Some people think durable is over 100, right? We're anywhere between 50 to 150,000 tons delivered, meaning tons that have been sequestered and proven to be sequestered by the appropriate registry systems. So we need orders of magnitude of growth over the next 20 some odd years to get to that 5 to 16 gigaton number. The majority of the carbon credits in circulation are being sold today are avoidance credits, right? They're cook stove, Red Plus, which is a forest protection project type. And while renewable energy was a popular credit type, and maybe less so now because the additionality is lower because renewables are closer to cost parity with fossil, which is a good thing. But basically what the market is working through today is what's the proper formula for supporting all these different technology types and all these different projects, over time, over the next 27 years. Finally got the calculation in my head. Or 26, that was incorrect. There you go. And, that is a question that we're also helping clients think through. A resource we often point to is the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting, which basically says that, we need to be supporting all the solutions today under the sun, right? Cook stoves, forest protection. They actually classify into different buckets based on avoidance versus removal, and avoidance with short duration storage versus long duration storage, and the same for removal. So like forest protection, forestry, afforestation, reforestation, biochar, direct air capture, everything. And then over time, shifting our portfolio more towards removal on a company basis, on a global basis. So we have that removal capacity in 2050 for global net zero. And, hypothetically along the way, maybe we get stronger forest protection clauses from governments throughout the world. So the additionality, similar to what's happening with renewable credits now, the additionality for Red Plus, for example, could make it so it doesn't need to be a credit in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And then all the money we're putting out is going towards durable removals, which still need that financing. So that's kind of the broad why. And in terms of lowering consumption, I kind of look at that as like the carbon price or the carbon tax that companies are putting on themselves. So like Microsoft's a great example. I think they do $100 for scope 1, 2, and 3 travel emissions, just scope 3 travel, and then $10 for the rest of scope 3. And the millions of dollars that result from that tax, they're buying a variety of traditionally removal credits, forestry, all the way to the more durable solutions, even like things like enhanced weathering. But what that's also doing is it's causing the business units to want to reduce their emissions as much as possible so they can save money, right? So I think they gave the example of like the Xbox unit within Microsoft, who optimized the hardware and software of the unit to be less carbon intensive, which has other business impacts. I'm sure it makes the machines faster and whatnot, but what it also does is it saves them money, and they treat it as like a competition internally, and that's helping to reduce consumption. I think where some of the sort of controversy in the voluntary carbon market has come from is taking the opposite view and saying companies are only buying credits once they're fully done with maybe even not reducing. Maybe they've done no reduction, right? And they just decide, okay, I'm going to go buy as many $3 credits as I can, and then I'm quote unquote carbon neutral. And that's not doing anything to reduce their consumption as a company or their emissions as a company. In reality, that's not really happening. It's kind of a flawed narrative, and it's one that the carbon market is looking to dispel. And there's a lot of interesting research out there. Trove is one body. Ecosystem Marketplace potentially did another one. I might be wrong there. I think they referenced it in some of their articles, but essentially companies who are buying carbon credits are shown to decarbonize faster. They care more. They're voting with their wallets in a way. And they are actually reducing their emissions. So that's the goal, right? It's basically in the absence of countries putting a price on emissions. This is the voluntary carbon market we're talking about. It's not the compliance market, right? In the absence of the US, it's not politically feasible right now, is what they keep telling us. I wish that wasn't the case, but to have a price on carbon, that's what carbon credits do. And that's what a higher internal price specifically does.
And so you mentioned with Microsoft imposing a tax, and that's entirely voluntary. They're essentially recording their carbon emissions, and then they're making a pledge essentially to invest X amount of money per ton of carbon that they emit into a removal or avoidance project. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, I believe Microsoft's actually only supporting removals today. But that's exactly right. And there's a lot of different approaches you could take. Money for money, which is setting aside 1% of your revenue, for example, similar to what 1% for the planet is all about as an organization. There's money for ton, which is what Microsoft is doing, and you're setting an internal carbon fee. And you're using that money to buy tons, typically equal to the same amount of your emissions. In Microsoft's case, they actually have a historical carbon negative pledge. So for all their emissions from the founding of the company, which I think was in the 70s, they're going to compensate for those emissions through the purchase of removal credits, which is amazing. And then there's ton for ton, which is using your tonnage, setting a budget, maybe hopefully at the beginning, maybe at the end, after you calculate them and deciding to buy credits. All of this is laid out really comprehensively in this new output papers, journals from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Kyle. And it's called Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, and it lays out a lot of different approaches companies can take. Really, what the some of the highest level takeaways of that piece are don't report lower emissions just because you buy credits, right? You can't use it to actually net out your emissions until your net zero year, when you need to be buying durable removals, which have not yet been defined by the SBTI. And don't say you're carbon neutral, really. They don't, I don't think they explicitly say that, but it is referenced like, here's an example of something that might be a little trickier. And we're seeing, lawsuits in the US and the EU for greenwashing for companies who arguably could have been well-intentioned and putting a lot of money in the right place, but maybe the claim wasn't scientifically accurate. Because if you think of the durability of a reforestation project even, and you think about the amount of time that your carbon emissions from flying in a plane or driving a car stay in the atmosphere, those aren't the same, right? So to actually offset your emissions, you would need to only be buying like direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering credits, which go for like $800 or $1,000 plus per ton, compared to a $20 reforestation credit or a $5 to $10 Red Plus avoidance credit.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's a that's a lot more complicated than I was kind of imagining. But okay, cool. So an aspect I find personally confusing about carbon credits is like, how do we know that each project is actually sequestering the amount of carbon that is advertised?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm like writing down some notes of things I want to touch on, because there's a lot of like entities involved. So there's what's called standards bodies. So like Vera, who came under fire in like the Guardian articles, which we can talk about. There's Gold Standard, there's Puro, Isometric. These companies, those latter two, are actually focused more on durable removals, like human engineered stuff. The job of those standards is primarily twofold. Number one, it's to publish methodologies, typically with leading scientists in the relevant field, that lay out the way that companies should, or product developers rather, should be accounting for the carbon impact of their activities. So for something like forestry, you're going to have a Vera, call it like VM 43, it might be. I know 44 is soil carbon, and I know 7 is Red Plus for the methodologies. And that's going to say, hey, here's how you need to design your project, and here's how you need to report on your project. And moving forward, you also need to have yearly, audit reports that also themselves have to be third-party verified by someone you pay to come in and double check your results. And so those methodologies, hypothetically, should give us accurate results. What we've seen is that older methodologies that don't, that at the time maybe were the best available science, today are not. So like an example is Red Plus, which came under a lot of fire in, the media in 2023. And honestly, maybe too much so, because it did hurt people who are protecting forests throughout the world. What that article was saying is, you've overstated the carbon impact of these articles. You've overstated the carbon impact, the carbon savings of these forest protection. Companies are buying these credits and saying, washing their hands of the guilt of their emissions, which I kind of talked about how that's changing. Those claims are changing. With the projects themselves, essentially the best available science at the time was, let's go out and measure trees with rulers, with ropes and equations, and we're gonna haircut the amount of credits we issue to be conservative, right? In actuality, that's not good enough today. Today we have AI, we have LiDAR, radar, we have satellites, machine learning, all these, how many buzzwords can I throw you, that are able to much more accurately understand the baseline scenario. So, how many trees were actually getting cut down, and are more able to effectively measure the impacts of the project, and therefore the credits that you ultimately get from the project are much more likely going to be a true 1 ton of carbon avoided or removed based on the project type. And that's pretty much the case across project types. Cook stoves, I gave the example of cocoa, like they're better able to understand the actual use of the cook stoves because they're able to understand the amount of fuel that is being taken out of the ATMs versus the old cook stove model where there's a lot of assumptions made. So I think like Internet of Things, what that's going to do for this space is awesome. Now on top of like just taking the methodologies or taking the rating agency, or sorry, instead of just taking the methodologies and the verifiers who and the standards who also operate registries where all the carbon credits live on like a digital ledger, instead of just taking their word, their binary yes no of this project is doing what they're saying they're doing, there's been a lot of new entities called rating agencies come onto the scene. So there's like B0, Silvera, Vernoster, Calix Global are probably 4 of the better known ones. And they're actually huge, teams of scientists who have specialties in forestry or biochar or whatever they're rating. And they're actually looking on a project by project basis and saying, are they doing what they said they're doing, right? And they're going to come out with ratings typically on like a AAA to D rating, I think following the lead of like, the S&P Global rating agencies of the world. And they are ultimately giving the buy side better certainty into what type of projects they're investing in. So a AAA or AA rating, for example, means that the ton you're buying actually does. We have high conviction, us as a rating agency, that this ton does equal a full ton that's actually avoided or removed. And they'll give you some insight into the permanence and other attributes. Or C or a single B rating means, okay, the credit you're purchasing might not actually equate to a full ton because maybe the project overcredited and they issued too many credits when in reality they didn't plant as many trees as they said they were going to, or they didn't, the forest was never at risk, or the risk wasn't as high as they said it was going to be. So these rating agencies have been very important in like buyers understanding the technologies. They've also worked with project developers to help the projects up their game, which is awesome to see. But I think they've been really important to the ecosystem as a whole, and so yeah, in some that's how we know.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm sure, as it's come up a few times, you come across a lot of questions and skepticism given the fairly new and exciting and kind of seemingly at times like wild westy market that carbon credits are. So what are some like common misconceptions that you encounter most often, and what are some valid criticisms of the system?
Now we're getting juicy. Common misconceptions. I think I already talked about one, but it's that companies who buy credits, aren't doing the hard work of reducing their emissions. No, like in reality, there's global leaders, Microsoft, Stripe, Shopify, Meta, McKinsey, JP Morgan has stepped up in a big way in the market, who, are often leading from a reduction standpoint. Take like tech, for example, they like evangelize like the VPPA market, like the solar power purchase agreement market. They're doing the same for carbon, right? And they want to reduce their emissions. They are also saying, hey, we have a very privileged economic position. Like we also want to evangelize this market. The majority of companies who are buying credits are serious about reduction, and they're serious about like taking the next step beyond their value chain and saying, we want to take responsibility for like the negative externalities that global CO2 emissions causes. So I think that's one big criticism. Another maybe area that people are talking about right now is removals, right? We only need to support removals because they're better, they're more efficient. We're not going to have they're more accurate. We're not going to have the Red Plus scandals. That's a misconception, or that's a sort of I don't believe that's true, really. We need to be supporting the carbon stocks we have in place today, and we need to be protecting forests through cook stoves and through any methods we can. And companies should be paying for it. And they should be celebrated for doing so as part of like a well-crafted portfolio approach. But removal is not all that matters. And I think the SBTI and their recent Beyond Value Chain Mitigation guidance, which I think companies are going to increasingly look towards, does a good job of saying that, right? It's not only about removals. Removals are very important, but I think people might have gotten removal vision as a result of some of the uncertainty around, avoidance calculation and some uncertainty around claims. Like they want to say, hey, we're fully carbon neutral, or we're completely offsetting our emissions, and the best way to do that is with removals. Like while that might be true in 2050, right, we still have a lot of work to do to protect existing carbon sinks, and like beyond carbon, like avoidance projects can have a massive I think here's another misconception. Carbon credits are just about the carbon. They're not. They're about the people, who their lives are improving because of improved farm yields from biochar, or they are finally getting paid for like the ecosystem services they're doing appropriately, or the biodiversity gains that are inherent in a lot of these carbon projects, like the animals and the flora that are being protected. I think one valid criticism could be like we need increasing transparency into the payment splits to communities. Like carbon's not a commodity. Like I don't think that a bunch of traders should be taking, huge, should be waiting for the price of carbon to go up and making all the money on the increase, right? They typically credits are bought to be retired, or should be, and that's typically how it's done through patch. And so on top of making sure that like the project developer and the community gets the lion's share of the benefit from an increase in price of carbon, we also need to make sure that there's like transparency into the fee breakdowns, right? If I'm selling a credit for $10, I guarantee that 50% or whatever percent is appropriate for the specific technology type to make it all work is going to the people on the ground who are doing the work, and the communities who like deserve that financial upside.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say bought to retirement, what does that mean?
Yeah, so carbon credit registries are hosted by standards. So like Vera has has a registry on their website. A lot of it's public. You could go on there. Some of the standards have more UX friendly and modern websites than others. But so like credits are going to be issued by a project, right, after they get all their verification document in place. And then they live like live, they're ready to be sold. And then when you are retiring them, you are claiming them, and you're going to say, hey, this is on behalf of Kyle Company as part of our, net zero journey, or as part of our climate funding initiatives, we are retiring this credit in 2022. That means that no one else can buy that credit from the project developer, meaning that it's not double counted. It is meaning that you are the sole owner of the impact of the credit. Now things get more complicated in an already like complicated space when you think about Article 6 and that's still not decided upon from the Paris Agreement and what's called corresponding adjustments. So basically, countries are going to begin trading their kind of carbon credits. They're called ITMOs, I believe. Something mitigation, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And there's been a couple, I forget which European country bought from maybe Ghana. But basically, the country is saying, hey, these mitigation outcomes that maybe our country has put in place through these programs can be transferred to other country who can use them to hit their nationally determined contribution. And that's hypothetically going to flow carbon finance from the emitting countries who have, prospered through polluting the environment to countries who need the finance and who are getting most hurt by climate change. Corresponding
Mhm.
adjustments mean that a company needs to ensure that if they're taking ownership of a credit or they're counting that removal towards like a net zero commitment, for example, that the country where the project originated is saying that's all good. You can count that as your own company who just bought this credit. We as the country are not going to count that emission removal as part of our nationally determined contribution. We're taking it off our ledger. It's yours. There's a lot of speculation around like how this is all going to happen. If companies aren't claiming carbon neutrality right now anymore until net zero year in 2050, like, do we even need corresponding adjustments? That's also being discussed. But there's a couple standards like CORSIA or programs rather that actually require corresponding adjustments. So airlines flying internationally are going to have to start buying credits to compensate for their emissions beyond like a 2020 baseline. And they need to be correspondingly adjusted. And there's only one project today that's supplying those. And I believe that's in Ghana. So it's getting complicated. So Switzerland and Ghana approved the transfer of Article 6 credits in February 29th of 2024. And just some live fact checking. I'm going to find out which country has the CORSIA eligible credits because it's going to bother me. Guyana, Guyana, has the eligible CORSIA credits, and Ghana, Ghana, did the ITMO transfer with Switzerland. If anyone wants to go look into that online.
Cool.
So
And so, yeah. And so, like at the moment, what stage of like the system would you say that we're in? Like I've heard about, we spoke a little bit about introducing carbon budgets, but right now the space is entirely voluntary with the companies like Microsoft that you mentioned earlier. So how far are we away from like a proper carbon budget being like enforced and introduced by, let's say, government entities or some other type of system?
it like depends geography wise. Europe and California have highly effective emission trading systems where in the case of California, right, like Tesla is able to sell a ton of credits to, I don't know, Ford or someone who is above the threshold that California has enacted. Because Tesla is greener and is below the threshold, right? That's a voluntary market. Patch does not play in that space yet. In Europe, they have the same thing, right? In the US, that's, I guess, not going to happen. So right now, the voluntary carbon market is companies standing up and saying, like, if the government's not going to do this, then like we are, and here's how. And
Mhm.
of course, it's complicated to get right when it's a lot of different voluntary actors trying to work in unity. But I'm very, it's promising to see the SBTI come out with this new guidance. It's promising to see this entity called the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, come out with new guidance around claims companies can make. They're called carbon integrity claims, sort of like a LEEDs claim for buildings, but for companies, maybe some more standardization, maybe less confusion, less greenwashing. And it's promising to see the ICVCM. There's like a million acronyms in this space. Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. coming out with the core carbon principles. There's like even an announcement today on these registries that or standards that got the initial stamp of approval. They're starting to give some more top-down market guidance, even though they themselves are non-governmental entities, non-government
Gotcha.
entities. Oh,
Yeah.
moving in the right
And
direction. We're not at the ministry of the future yet, where there's like crypto, carbon credits are going to save the world, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you.
so, I mean, so what's in it for these companies that are doing it entirely voluntary? Like, why is Microsoft receiving is this like a marketing angle where customers are more likely to shop at Microsoft because they know that they're being responsible? Is there a financial benefit of doing so?
Mhm.
What's the purpose for, spending all of this time and money into something that they frankly don't have to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like an advertisement for the SBTI's Beyond Value Chain Mitigation document, but like it's a 120-page document, and I think there's a second one of a similar length that lays out the business decisions, the business reasons to do this, and does it in the most comprehensive way that I've seen, and that's better than anything I'll be able to give you. So for anyone who's curious, go check that out. But basically, there's a lot of different reasons for companies to be doing it. Employees care, right? If you're 20 some odd, 30 some odd, 40 some odd, I don't want to like be ageist here, but people care about climate change and they want to work for companies who care, right? You rather go work for Stripe or Shopify because they have these amazing, they're leaders and they are leaders in sustainability. You rather go work for them than boring tech company 123 that does nothing with sustainability. And that's just like pretty hard to argue against. So that's one reason that that the SBTI points to. Investors are aligned because they know consumers want to spend money with brands who are more environmentally focused, right? So you can raise money more easily because customers want to support brands who they know are doing the right thing. And then marketing, right? Marketing that impacts to customers. Beyond that, right? There's good people who work at these companies and they also want to do the right thing. They know that they especially these companies who make a lot of money and don't have very high emissions. So that's like a concept known as profit per ton. So how much do you make per ton you emit? And like the Microsofts of the world have a very high profit per ton ratio where they make a lot of money and they don't per every ton they emit. So they are in the privileged economic position where they can like jumpstart this market. Whereas on the
Gotcha.
side, maybe you look at like an industrial company or maybe even an airline, and they don't make their profit per ton emitted is much lower. They don't make a ton of money for every ton they emit. And so like maybe the responsibility that those companies have in the latter bucket I gave you is less, right? For carbon credits specifically because of the economic realities they're in. Now, the SBTI, BCM guidance says like an airline could support DAC, direct air capture, because it's permanent. It's going to help them neutralize their emissions in 2050. It could also be a feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel, directly capturing carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it. But yeah, hopefully I gave you some good reasons.
Yeah, for sure. And so in your opinion, like what would you how would you argue that this is like an effective system? Like how is this a system that's going to contribute to net zero by 2050 like you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean it's in the absence of government policy um, that effectively puts a price on carbon and prices the negative externality that companies have never had to pay for. Uh, Carbon credits, high integrity carbon projects are distributing money directly to projects that are delivering outcomes. And like an example of a really awesome thing I got to work on recently is we're working with this biochar company um, in Africa, and they are brand new, and they are taking invasive species burning it in the absence of oxygen, and creating biochar and giving it to farmers free of charge, who are distributing it on their soil, sequestering carbon, reclaiming their land, lowering deforestation in search of, fertile, farmland. And a company gets the carbon impact of that and, also the amazing co-benefits. That is, call it like $500,000, $1 million that wasn't going to go to that country or to those farmers, or to that company who's going to scale their operations in the region without carbon finance. So it's things like that that get me super excited, and like all the innovation too. You're paying for carbon credits, allow you to pay for something that's not financially viable today, that needs carbon finance. The additionality is there and needs carbon finance to happen in order for the claim of the credit to be legitimate. So like concrete decarbonization, for example, is, I think, in a large part being led by the voluntary carbon market, because these concrete companies, they have to charge more for their decarbonized concrete that has different inputs, or it has direct air capture even injected into it, CO2. So it has less cement, it's less carbon intensive, it has avoidance and removal elements. And they are able to like compete in a very competitive like cement concrete market due to the use of carbon credit revenue. So their prices are lower, and like they're able to attract investors and employees and scientists to scale the technology. So like on top of, and the same thing could be said with DAC and SAF, right? Like there's going to be amazing innovations that come out of carbon removal and carbon avoidance and the voluntary carbon market, beyond just the obvious like carbon impacts today. And that's super exciting.
Yeah, very cool. So just to start to wrap it up here, how do you see the overall system evolving over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, my crystal ball. I'm like, yeah, I have no idea. No, I'm just kidding. We're gonna see more integrity, which is exciting. Like this concept known as MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, is going to continue to improve through things like AI and satellite imagery and just the best available science getting better every single day. And so people are going to have more confidence in the projects they support. We are going to see more companies join the project developer space. So, we talked to a company called Andes. They're on our marketplace. And if you know what enhanced rock weathering is, where you take like basaltic rock and you spread it on soil, and that sequesters carbon, soil and organic carbon, and then it washes to the ocean and gets stored there as bicarbonate. What Andes is doing is they're taking microbes and spreading those microbes on farmland throughout the US right now, and leading to soil and organic carbon, and it's lighter and it's easier to transport, and has all these other co-benefits. And like that's a new iteration almost on like enhanced rock weathering, which is already like a brand new technology. So like you're gonna see these project developers doing the most interesting, fascinating things that you've never thought about before. And that's going to continue to get financed through the voluntary carbon market. And then you're going to see more companies on the demand side joining in, making bigger pledges, being more transparent about which projects they're supporting and how much money they're putting into each project. And you are going to see Patch turn into a billion-dollar company. We'll see. And you're going to see maybe me and Kyle rocking it in the VCM together.
Exactly. So, I mean, if you could answer this quickly, I want to be respectful of your time as well. How is you kind of alluded to it before, in that the high earnings to carbon or earnings to emissions ratio companies, it's kind of easier for them to be investing in stuff like this.
Right.
how do you see the relationship with hard to abate industry like concrete or transportation, more carbon intensive companies working to solve, or address these issues?
Yeah, I mean, like take the case of concrete. I mean, it's very localized, so like these companies might just not even be big enough to really uh have the resources to put into buying credits, but someone like Patch can certainly help. Um, People in the space argue that companies with much lower ratios of profits per ton emitted should focus on reduction, right? Like they should be using any of their revenue to be focused on, um, greening their practices. Uh, Someone in concrete could launch a carbon credit project or work with a lot of the project developers who will come and have like drop in equipment or help them change their processes to become more green and sequester carbon or avoid carbon emissions, and use carbon finance as a way to help do that. But yeah, I mean, look to bodies like the SBTI maybe to continue to come out with sector specific guidance around what companies should be doing, um, specific to their profile related to the voluntary carbon market in the absence of government regulation, in the next 5 years. Look for that to happen as well.
Mhm. Yeah, very cool. And so, what advice would you give to someone that's interested in working in the space of carbon credits or
Hmm.
climate tech, more generally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone listening to this, maybe you're in the Columbia network, or even if you're not, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Tighe Sullivan Jr. on LinkedIn. Um, but there's like so many meetups. Climate Tech Cities is a cool newsletter that has meetups throughout the country. I'm sure Europe has a lot of cool meetups too, where you can meet people. Everyone in the space seems pretty willing to talk, right? We're all like driven by a certain shared set of beliefs. Um, but there's also so many like great resources. My Climate Journey is a great podcast. The Carbon Curve is specific to the carbon removal space. Um, Bloomberg Green. I like to, like, maybe this is nerdy, but like go on a walk or go to the gym or something and put on a podcast, one of these climate tech podcasts, because it helps me do my job better, but it's also just like really interesting stuff. Um, and so I think that, not to say that like the VCM is for everyone, right? Like you might be more drawn to carbon measurement, or you might be more drawn to circularity. Like kind of, I think good advice is to set a wide net if you're getting into the space and just like see what pulls you in. And then listen to resources, talk to people in that specific area, and then before you know it, um, hopefully you'll be in a position where you can, yeah, be working in sustainability full time.
Yeah, cool. So, in other words, network, research, and just learn as much as possible.
There you go.
So, yeah, we're really fortunate to have people, as clearly as knowledgeable and passionate as you are to be, pushing innovation and kind of encouraging us to be moving in the right direction. So, thank you so much for your time. It was a really informative conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm excited, but also a little scared to listen to the